well to the southwest of both Darwin and Melville Islands. Because Hans was so far off in his estimation, they had no idea the trouble they were in. Among Western Australia's 9 regions, Kimberley is the furthest north. Regardless of where you are along the coast, you've got vast ocean on one side and the barren Australian bush on the other. Kimberley has quite a history that goes back about 65,000 years as well. It's the location of one of Australia's earliest societies where rock drawings have been discovered that have maybe the very first appearance of the boomerang. Incredibly, geographically, Kimberley is about 3 times larger than England in terms of landmass and includes steep mountain ranges and dry grasslands. Where Hans and Klausmann ended up, however, was on the side of Kimberley, which has an expansive landscape of arid, cracked clay. Kimberley also has a prolific wet season because it sits in a tropical monsoon climate, but that period had already passed for 1932. The two had instead arrived near the beginning of the dry season, which coincides with Australian winter, meaning temperatures would not be at their peak. With that said, it is still one of the hottest regions and can regularly see temperatures over 80
I don't understand the weather.
Celsius even then. In any case, after guiding the plane safely ashore, Hans made a note of his fuel readings. According to the gauge, the Atlantis had just 4 gallons of fuel remaining, which wasn't really enough to fly anywhere. Once they were on shore, the men made camp for the night and checked out their surroundings for potential supplies, but all they found was a lot of nothing. And while they weren't in the thick of the Australian bush, they were certainly surrounded by it. Sometime later, while they were trying to get some rest, an Aboriginal man stumbled onto them, possibly coming to check out the area after seeing them land nearby. Aboriginal Australians are descendants of the migrants that arrived more than 60,000 years ago and are indigenous to the continent. Depending on location, Aboriginal cultures and languages vary greatly, and when they were approached by the man, the language barrier was immediately clear. The man was friendly, but neither of the aviators could understand him, so the man eventually wandered away and disappeared. Had they known just how desperate their situation was, they may have tried a little harder to communicate with the man. By the next morning, the weather had cleared and the sun was already starting to turn the heat up for the day. Hans had to figure out what to do next, and the only thing he could come up with was try to get as close to Darwin as he could before his fuel ran out. He wasn't even sure the plane had enough fuel to get airborne, but incredibly, after picking up speed and pulling back on the yoke, the Atlantis returned to the sky. Because of where Hans thought they were, he headed west and began flying more and more inland. After they had gone just 22 miles though, as expected, the engine suddenly cut out. At that point, Hans was essentially piloting a glider, which actually gave him time to try to figure out where to put the plane down. Fortunately, he was able to guide the Atlantis back to the coastline, and once again, Hans and Klausmann found themselves stranded on the beach with nothing and no one around. They spent much of that day trying to locate water, but they were unsuccessful in that venture, and the longer they went without it, the more Hans thought about the Aboriginal man they encountered the night before. Despite their difficulties understanding one another verbally, it still would have been easy to indicate with hand signals that they needed water. Hans regretted leaving the area they camped in overnight, and he convinced Klausmann that they needed to walk their way back in hopes of coming across the same man or others from his tribe. As they began to traverse Kimberley's unforgiving landscape, the heat and their hunger and thirst took a massive toll on the men. If that wasn't enough, they were surrounded by swarms of flies the entire time, buzzing by their ears and landing on their sweating faces. During this walk, though, luckily they were able to find some water and some berries that were safe to eat. They also had a single packet of cookies one of them brought for the trip to Australia, and they began rationing those, but this did little to satisfy what had become an intense hunger, and things were about to get much, much worse. As they continued along the coastline, they came up to an inlet which presented them with 2 choices. They could either walk around it and add untold miles to their trek, or they could swim across it. Now, today, Australia has a well-known reputation for the massive crocodiles that inhabit only their northern region. This was not always so familiar to the outside world, and it wasn't known to either Hans or Klausmann. The 2 men then stripped down and entered the water, carrying their clothes over their heads as they waded across the inlet. Suddenly, one of them spotted a dark, scaly figure coming right for them. Both men immediately dropped their clothing and began swimming as hard as they could in a desperate attempt to save their lives. Thankfully, the crocodile wasn't interested in putting up too much of a chase, and it allowed them to make an escape. Reaching safety on the other side of the inlet was about their only stroke of luck since having set the plane down, but the decision to cross the water instead of walking around it came at a great price.
Now they lost their clothes.
They were now stranded and lost in searing heat without clothing and their boots. Worse yet, among the items they dropped in their panic over the crocodile were their pistols. This felt like a major turning point for Hans. As long as they had their firearms, they always had a chance to find and secure food for themselves. Without them, the 2 knew next to nothing about how to capture game in the Australian bush. So, naked and barefoot, the 2 men had to admit defeat. they would end up deciding that their best course of action was to head back to the plane, meaning their swim across the inlet and the loss of all their supplies was completely pointless. They did, however, learn from this and decide to walk inland instead of getting back into the water. It would also end up taking the better part of the next 7 days to get back to the plane. During that time, the sun beat down on them and the mosquitoes picked at their skin, and when they checked out the area around the plane, they were both disheartened to find it exactly as they left it. For the last leg of the trek, they held on to hope that someone had come across the plane and was there waiting for them, but that was unfortunately not the case. By then, they had been stranded on the Kimberley coast for 13 days with very little food, and now back at the plane, the area was completely devoid of fresh water. Hans was the kind of guy who always seemed to have an endless supply of energy, and this trait served him well during their ordeal to that point, but he was starting to feel weaker and more exhausted as each day passed. He knew that it was only going to get worse if they didn't find a better situation fast, so he started thinking of a way to get them practically anywhere else. This caused him to take a closer look at the Atlantis. Their Junkers W-33 seaplane had the ability to touch down on land and in water thanks to 2 large pontoons called floats that are fixed underneath the plane. Each of the floats had 4 airtight compartments that kept the plane buoyant, and if they could hold the forces of water landings, Hans wondered if they could hold up against the open ocean too. He then presented this idea to Klausman, and the pair got to work removing one of the floats. Using scrap wood and whatever else he could find, Hans fitted the makeshift boat with a crude sail and rudder, and with a piece of aluminum he made paddles. As they were wrapping up their construction, a rain shower came through, which gave Hans another idea. He opened another one of the watertight compartments and allowed it to fill with some rainwater. Neither of them knew how long they'd be on the island. The pair got if they didn't find it weaker and more exhausted as each energy, and this trait served him well during their ordeal to that point, but he was starting to feel weaker and more exhausted. The area was completely Kimberley coast for 13 days with very little food. Someone had come across the plane and was there waiting for them, but that was unfortunately not the case. On the plane, they were both disheartened to find out on them and the mosquitoes picked at their skin, and when they checked out the area around the plane, they did, however, learn from this, and the loss of all their supplies was completely pointless. They did, however, learn from this and decide to walk inland instead of getting back into the water. It would also end up taking the better part of the next 7 days to get back to the plane. During that time, the sun beat down on them and the mosquitoes picked at their skin, and when they checked out the area around the plane, they were both disheartened to find it exactly as they left it. For the last leg of the trek, they held on to hope that someone had come across the plane and was there waiting for them, but that was unfortunately not the case. By then, they had been stranded on the Kimberley coast for 13 days with very little food, and now back at the plane, the area was completely devoid of fresh water. Hans was the kind of guy who always seemed to have an endless supply of energy, and this trait served him well during their ordeal to that point, but he was starting to feel weaker and more exhausted as each day passed. He knew that it was only going to get worse if they didn't find a better situation fast, so he started thinking of a way to get them practically anywhere else. This caused him to take a closer look at the Atlantis. Their Junkers W-33 seaplane had the ability to touch down on land and in water thanks to 2 large pontoons called floats that are fixed underneath the plane. Each of the floats had 4 airtight compartments that kept the plane buoyant, and if they could hold the forces of water landings, Hans wondered if they could hold up against the open ocean too. He then presented this idea to Klausman, and the pair got to work removing one of the floats. Using scrap wood and whatever else he could find, Hans fitted the makeshift boat with a crude sail and rudder, and with a piece of aluminum he made paddles. As they were wrapping up their construction, a rain shower came through, which gave Hans another idea. He opened another one of the watertight compartments and allowed it to fill with some rainwater. Neither of them knew how long they'd be on the ocean, but if they somehow got stuck out there for any length of time, having some fresh water would be crucial to their survival. Before they set off, Hans also drained whatever water remained from the plane's radiator. Finally and carefully, the men carried the float-turned kayak to the water and hopped into their designated compartments. They then pushed off, but within moments the rudder was ripped off by the waves and the sail proved completely worthless. By the time they figured out that they were aimless and directionless, the plane float had gotten into the current and was being pulled out to sea. The only way the exhausted men could navigate the float was with their paddles, which were only marginally helpful. Several days would end up passing with the float stuck about 12 miles off the Kimberley coast when one of them saw a large black speck on the horizon. Over the course of minutes, it got bigger and bigger until they realized it was a ship. They weren't able to stand up in the float compartments, but they did everything they could to draw attention to themselves. The two stood there and shouted and screamed, and in their minds it was all but certain they would be saved. But then at a distance of about 1,600 feet, the ship passed by them without hesitation. When it was clear the ship was gone and began to disappear into the distance, they slumped back into their compartments. The disappointment was beyond description, and when Hans looked at Klausman, he immediately knew that something was off about him. It was like something had changed, like Klausman had broken on the inside. After a while, they continued paddling, and Hans had to do much of the work since Klausman was becoming despondent. Even still, for 4 nights and the better part of 5 days afterward, they paddled before miraculously reaching land northwest of Cape Bernier. Back on solid ground, they rested briefly before Hans had them back on their feet. Still certain they were on Melville Island, Hans felt like they might be able to find civilization if they just walked inland. So for a week, they traveled across some of the world's most deadly terrain
again,
without
they
a stitch of
walked?
clothing on their bodies or anything on their feet. Soon enough, Hans finally came to the realization that they couldn't be where he thought they were. The distances just didn't make sense. If they were where he thought they were, they should have seen some semblance of civilization. So, once again, the best thing to do in his mind was to backtrack their way to the coast and find the plane float. After another week of walking, the two men located the plane float and made another disheartening discovery. The float had somehow gotten damaged in their absence. Hans thought there was a chance it could still keep them above water if he cut off the affected compartment, so he grabbed a pair of tin snips and was careful not to puncture the neighboring compartment. They managed to carry the float back to the water and hop into it, but they quickly found out that it was no longer even minimally seaworthy. When they got back on shore, they located a rock ledge overhang at Cape Bernier to shelter under, and both men collapsed. Almost 4 days after contact with the Atlantis had stopped back in May, the German consul raised the alarm with the Western Australian government and requested that a search effort be organized to find the two men. Mail planes became search planes, and all the ships sailing along the Australian coast were notified to keep an eye out for a plane or castaways. Additionally, Aboriginal tribes were recruited to assist in finding the men, as no group was more intimately familiar with the land than the country's indigenous people. And incredibly, while searching on foot, one group located a cigarette case with the initials HB on it and a handkerchief in the sand. These items were then handed off to be taken to search officials. On June 15th, more than 1 month after it disappeared, a search plane located the Atlantis about 99 miles or 160 kilometers from the town of Wyndham in Western Australia.
And
Unfortunately, there was no sign of the two missing aviators, but searchers felt like they were now hot on their trail. At the same time the search was ratcheting up, the will to live had faded from Hans and Klausman. They had sort of come to accept their fate, which they believed was to wait inside a Cape Bernier cave for death to find them. But, while lying around close to lifeless on the morning of June 22nd, an Aboriginal man, not the same one they encountered earlier, noticed the two men just inside the mouth of the cave and went to investigate. When he reached them, the man was confident that this was who he and many others had been searching for. Hans opened his eyes and squinted upwards as he felt someone watching him. When his vision cleared, he could barely believe what he was witnessing. And unlike the Aboriginal men Hans and Klausman encountered on their first night, they were able to establish communication. The Aboriginal man had a fish that he eagerly handed over, but both men were so weak and dehydrated that they couldn't even chew their own food. The man then helped them by literally chewing up pieces of fish, spitting them out, and then hand-feeding them. After
What
some
the
time,
fuck?
with some of their strength returning, the man led them to a well-protected bay where they made camp. Once they got there, he handed Hans 2 tins full of preserved meat and 5 pounds of flour. That evening, he also speared a kangaroo to the amazement of the men before cooking it and feeding them once again. The next morning, 2 more Aboriginal men showed up. The food the night before had done wonders for Hans and Klausman, but they were still weakened from their ordeal. And although each of them was demonstrating different symptoms of mental instability, Hans was loose enough to write out a quick note and hand it to one of the men. The night before, the Aboriginal man that fed them told them about a priest nearby, so Hans instructed one of them to get the message to him. On the note were a few details about their ordeal and information about where they were located. Then, finally, on July 6th, all that the 2 men had endured would come to a conclusion. That morning, more Aboriginal people arrived at the Cape Bernier camp with supplies sent by the priest, and not long after, the rest of the search party arrived. Just like he had with the man who found them in the cave, Hans excitedly greeted the new arrivals and shook each of their hands. In turn, they gave him oranges, bread and butter, and cigarettes, which Hans and Klausman immediately began smoking. Both of them were eventually taken to Wyndham, and once they arrived, Klausman was in such bad shape that he had to be carried ashore. In addition to severe dehydration and malnutrition, he was still suffering mentally from when he reached his breaking point on the ocean. Hans then instructed rescuers to get Klausman to the hospital, but despite Hans insisting that he was also fine, he was made to go along too. At the hospital, they were treated to a large breakfast, and Klausman was put into a bed to rest and recover. Hans was certainly better off than his companion, and while he had lost a lot of weight and suffered from dehydration, his condition didn't require him to be hospitalized. From the moment they landed in Cape St. Lambert until they reached the safety of the hospital, more than 50 days had passed. In the aftermath of the
50
ordeal,
days.
Hans returned to the site of the Atlantis with another mechanic, and they were able to get the plane in working order. They then flew it to Perth, Australia. Klausmann, however, was in such bad condition both physically and mentally, he was put aboard a steamship bound for Germany. The newspapers that reported on the incident noted that Klausmann was expected to make a full recovery, but he never did. He remained in a broken mental state for the rest of his life. Hans, meanwhile, was also mentally traumatized by his experience, but he stayed behind in Australia for a few months and essentially went on a speaking tour to tell his harrowing survival story. He then went from town to town, giving talks to crowds that were eager to hear about what happened directly from one of the men who experienced it.
Damn.
And this ambition almost cost him his life yet again when he crashed the plane at an airport on landing. The Atlantis suffered extensive damage, but Hans managed to escape without any serious injury. In the aftermath as well, and during interviews with reporters serving a very interested public, Hans would go out of his way to heap praise on the Aboriginal man who found them at Cape Rainier and those who arrived the next day. Along with helping to feed them, ensuring they were replenished with as much water as they could, the Aboriginal men built what's called a bush humpy, which is a small hut constructed with available materials. This was in order to keep Klausmann protected from the elements in his poor state of health. In addition, in fact, from the moment they encountered the indigenous men, Hans said he finally felt like someone was on their side, which boosted their morale and restored their hopes of leaving the Australian bush alive. Hans also gave full credit to the men for saving their lives, as it's almost certain that both of them would have been dead long before the European search party located them. And until his death in 1993 at the age of 86, Hans would always refer to his Aboriginal
93.
saviors as his best friends. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Live TV, where nothing is scripted and every second could be your last. These are some of the darkest.
Lives. Duke.
Rescue planes search the Newfoundland forests for the Belgian transatlantic airliner which crashed with 44 passengers.
"27 people died here, and they're buried here on site. There's actually a cemetery right beside the plane here. It's a very sacred place. Anybody that comes up here should show respect.
I haven't seen anything like this before. I can't believe it's still here.
In the past few centuries, just a few areas left on Earth eluded polar.
Or even knew about it, but it was definitely there. A user named Krut was a staff member, making important decisions inside of VMK's Halo faction. But tensions were brewing between these two figureheads. They were constantly disagreeing with each other and competing for control within the group. But the biggest difference between these two was their political alignment. Krut became aware of VMK's obsession and his hostile attitude, and a lot of other people in this group did as well. Forum posts would describe VMK as awfully terrible and very deceiving. And these comments, they add up. When you look deeper into VMK's account, some disturbing posts, like wishing death upon others and telling someone to pour gasoline on their chest and ignite themselves, simply because he disagreed with their opinion. VMK's comments and attitude would pretty much ignite a civil war within his Halo faction. This rebellion was led by a user named We4, along with Krut, who at this point were repulsed by VMK. And a lot of people agreed with them, so they followed the rebellion and confronted VMK. But when faced with confrontation, VMK decided to, instead of putting up any sort of fight, to flee. He left the group entirely, leaving his Halo faction in the hands of Krut and We4. Rather than abandon the world of Roblox clans and diplomacy, he would try his luck once more, this time someplace that felt closer to his beliefs. VMK Sillin would create a faction called the Germanic.
From Carter to you? Oh, what is this?
You gotta have faith, like Cinemarxism, right? Brett is a person I think would literally fight to win an unwinnable fight. I think Brett is the kind of person that would fucking stand in front of somebody for a bullet, you know, for his you know, his marginalized friends. Okay.
Oh, thank you, Carter. How would I know? I never could. I've taken a lot of punches and a lot of bruises. I protest for it, but who knows?
Empire, which was a clear representation of Nazi.
Also, not really something I aspire. You know, I'm not trying to get shot. I would prefer to not be shot, actually.
He added his own twist.
Yeah.
An alternate history group, one where Germany won the Second World War. The group description gives us a disturbing look.
Oh my God.
It reads, "We do not mourn what has happened before, as
Oh yeah, this is wild.
happens in the future. What could have been made as a perfect world." And even more alarmingly, one man promised peace. And this group goes to show what that man was planning after the war. A future for all of us that is not only overwhelming, but underrated by most. His Roblox inventory
This is crazy.
was a glimpse into this faction, as it was filled with Nazi-themed apparel. There are exactly 64 pieces of clothing, at least that I could find, split between his main and alternate account. From German infantry to SS divisions, and even Hitler's personal jacket. It's actually quite impressive how many uniforms he was able to upload. I'm surprised to see this many get past Roblox's moderation system. But on that same note, however, some assets VMK had uploaded for his German faction were not so lucky. My guess is that one of his uniforms boasted a swastika on it, as he would make quite the unhinged forum post around this time, complaining about
This game sucks. Too much rules. Although the game might be designed for kids, they make such big deals out of things they don't even understand. Post a swastika, and they scream at you. Post a Soviet emblem and they allow it. They could split the age groups, but they continue to integrate them and continue to ban and use the excuse the game is designed for children. The game's designed to be a sandbox game. It was formatted into a kid's game. First example of this would be allowing unmoderated Lua scripts.
about Roblox's moderation. He said there were too many rules, and questioned why Roblox would ban the swastika, and not the Soviet hammer and sickle. Of course, nobody really agreed with him, but there were some people that did. A user named Kainali was one of the only people that followed VMK since his abdication from the Halo faction. He had followed VMK through thick and thin, and was determined to help VMK with his next
How
project.
old is this guy? I think he's still young. I think he's still like a child. Based on his spelling
After
and the fact that he's in Sandbox,
which,
or that he's in Roblox.
by the way, is the best Halo game of all time, the popularity of Halo on the platform.
Yeah, I'd say under 16 too.
More people than ever before were interested in joining and fighting for a Halo faction, and VMK didn't like this. The Halo genre as a whole was undoubtedly more popular than ever before.
I'm not having a good
He
time.
was no longer in control. So VMK would start over, scrapping his German group, and he would make an entirely new Halo faction, but he would have to abandon his VMK account to start on a fresh slate. His reputation was already stained. His new account was named Alpha Loopy, and he would use this account to try and replicate his earlier success. For the sake of the video, I'm just still going to call him VMK, just so it's easier. Anyways, there was a huge brick wall that was preventing him from making any progress. K-Rut and his Halo group were massive at this point. In fact, he almost
That's crazy, Sunrise.
genre. But this wouldn't exactly stop VMK. He had a master plan brewing, and it must work. Kane Ollie and VMK would approach K-Rut with an offer. They would merge whatever following they had into his Halo group and control only the Marine detachment. K-Rut was reluctant. He asked VMK a pretty important question. Didn't you lead a Nazi Germany faction? But VMK had a very clever response. Actually, my cousin was in control of my account and he did that. Sorry.
Ah, classic. Classic, dude.
At least for now. And he would accept the proposition VMK had initially offered. And for now, it seemed like a happy ending. Everyone seemed to get along. But this wouldn't last very long. VMK and his followers had essentially Trojan horsed their way into K-Rut's faction. From the inside, they would gather a larger following and spread ideas of dissent. And before long, they would attempt to coup K-Rut and take the faction for themselves. Of course, this wouldn't be very successful. He didn't have enough influence within the community to even achieve this.
Bro, why didn't they? I don't understand. Why didn't everybody else just vote them away? I thought everybody was very clear the way to get rid of fascism is by voting really, really hard. So, what's the problem?
He would then be forcefully removed from the genre, hoping to be never seen again. His hope in the Halo community was essentially gone at this point.
What's the issue here?
He had hope for a new project, one that would pretty much change Roblox forever. A TV series was pretty popular around this time. It showcased a historical depiction of the Roman Empire. It focused heavily on the drama and the scandals, and the almost dictatorial power dynamic. It was loved by the general audience, and among this audience was VMK Sillin, who found himself more inspired rather than entertained. It lit a light bulb in his head. He would follow a blueprint laid out by the TV show, which depicted the Roman Empire as a hierarchy, with the emperor at the top, followed by his councils and an organized senate. The emperor would have almost complete control, making the majority of the faction's decisions. The emperor was also worshipped in a way. The councils were handpicked by...
Yeah, I was gonna ask how that show is actually. I've never seen it. It was like Game of Thrones but historical.
the emperor, with the purpose of helping to maintain control. And now the Senate was a bit different. It was filled
Wasn't it on like Showtime?
with influential figures, and the purpose
okay.
was to create a board of directors almost, which would aid in decision-making and military reforms. But it would be pretty difficult to replicate this in Roblox. The game features were pretty limited, but VMK Sillin, who had now changed his username to Your Caesar, of
Oh, it was on HBO. Oh, interesting.
course inspired by Rome's Julius Caesar, he'd already made up his mind. And so he gathered his close friends and he built out a government which mirrored the Rome TV show. One of his Senate members was Mark Antonius. I'm just going to call him Mark for now. He was a pretty good developer on Roblox, and he was well experienced in coding, building, and designing on the game's engine. He had created a game for Your Caesar's Roman project, known as Roman Parthia. It was pretty revolutionary at the time. It was equipped with a resource gathering system, an economy, custom-made weapons, and even a building system. And as a result, the game became very popular.
Hi, hello, it's Mo. Thank you for the sub.
Roblox themselves
8 months.
made a
Fuck
video
yeah.
on their YouTube channel showcasing this game and its revolutionary technology. And as a result, this would bring so many new players to the game.
Uh-oh.
And all of these people would
Wait, Roblox, the company, co-signed this shit?
eventually find themselves joining and participating in your Caesar's Rome.
Uh-oh.
Get your comrades together and prepare for battle at Roman Partha by Mark Antonius. In Roman Partha, the objective is to team up and attack enemies, and clearly the setting is ancient Rome, so players have to craft their own swords, armor, shields, clothes, and tools from resources nearby. This is a nice break from first-person shooters, but it's still a blend of old and new, since it revisits classic sword fighting and introduces the concept of shields. Along with this, players are given an excellent GUI and a gorgeous map. At the time of review, Roman Partha had nearly 300,000 visits and 84% thumbs up with no access fee. If you have a good group of friends and you like to raid, definitely give this game a try. It's entirely possible to go in solo and form a team on the
I love a good GUI, yeah.
fly, but it's probably better if you play with a group of players that you know and trust.
This looks like absolute trash. Well, it was made in 2010 in Roblox, dude.
Caesar's Roman faction had exploded. It was pretty much the largest group at the time. Of course, this would feed his ego. He felt as if he had so much influence. And in reality, he did. He was seen as a pretty big figure throughout the group and on Roblox as a whole. But he was worried that rebellion would soon brew, a threat to his control. After all, in the TV show Rome, the emperor was betrayed. In real life too, of course, but the TV show was your Caesar's main point of influence. And he wasn't very confident with the idea of being betrayed or losing his position of power. So he would enact some pretty major reforms in the group, most notably the organization of his Roblox army. The army was split between two major distinctions.
Dude, this is so insane. You're like going through a fucking governmental substructure shit for a Roblox thing. Like, oh my god. People are not okay.
The legions and the paramilitaries. The legions were like regiments, each having their own number assigned to them, and each had their own officers.
Like, come on. These people are doing this for free.
The paramilitaries, on the other hand, were...
We build our own prisons. True.
They were pretty important to the story. The urban cohorts were pretty much like the police, who'd patrol the Roman Parthia game, cementing control over the civilian players. There was also a small navy, known as the Classis Italia, and the Lictors Guild, which was a group of guards in charge of keeping senators and important people safe. And finally, but most notably, the Praetorian Guardsmen.
It's so funny because, like, you can just respawn, right? Like, if Caesar gets murdered, he can just respawn, right? Right?
These guys would protect the emperor himself, along with his family. They were known for their heavy training and complete discipline. These guys would be on the game for almost 24/7, training and patrolling the game. They were dedicated to the empire.
Nah, he would die IRL. True. Damn, I didn't understand.
Along with the military, your Caesar and his council of senators would also craft a set of laws that players would be forced to follow, or they would face persecution. The majority of these laws are just...
Like, I'm sorry, but if I join this a Roblox server, if I join a Roblox server and they give me a PDF that are the laws of the country, like, I'm either A, leaving immediately, or B, using those laws as a rulebook of all the shit that I'm gonna do to troll these loser ass motherfuckers. Like, I am gonna troll these fucking dorks until they boot me from this shit forever.
It's outright discriminatory, and they were setting almost dark tone over this Roblox faction. But it was all part of Julius Caesar's plan. His plan to have an ultra-loyalist group of people. In an uncovered Trello page, we are able to take a glimpse at some of these laws that were enforced. Some of the more notable laws included a strict skin color guideline, which forced all players to have only human skin colors and not the dark. However, players with a dark skin color were frowned upon and even banned from any positions of power. But another set of laws, known as degeneracy laws, were even worse. This set of
Okay, now we're getting into it. Okay.
laws was labeled as a way to outlaw all forms of degeneracy within the ranks of Rome. Listed
Brother, you're playing Roblox. What do you mean degeneracy? Everything you're doing is degenerate. What the fuck are we talking about? You are the degenerate, man. You are the degenerate. Like, what are we doing?
as prohibited in the empire was the following: race mixing, feminism, homosexuality, and a pool of other things I just can't really say on YouTube. And surprisingly enough, this is really just the beginning. As Your Caesar's Rome grew and expanded, it required more developers to maintain the games and assets. So he would recruit someone new, and his name was MathMinded. The first project that MathMinded embarked on was a game titled The Temple of Apollo. The purpose of this game was to document important events that happened during the lifespan of Your Caesar's Rome. It gives us a glimpse into this community from the perspective of its leaders. The first mural within the temple is titled Hero of Rome. It showcased a man on a hill being lit up by a beam of light. Above him are a set of figures. These figures represent some of the important gods in Roman mythology. According to MathMinded himself,
Dude, what is this guy doing now?
the person on the hill is supposed to represent Mark Antonius, and how the gods supposedly chose him to build the Roman Parthia game. The next mural shows another man, possibly the same man from the previous mural, now rallying a large group of people behind him. And the next mural shows a clear representation of Your Caesar, now rallying an army of his own. The text Hail Rome appears next to him. But this next mural is definitely the most shocking, but it's going to help us unravel a part of this dark story. It shows a man ordering the death of another man, and the text above reads, Rope Day.
Nice.
I'm sorry, what? Bro, what the fuck is happening on this server right now? Dude. Yeah, someone get your kids is right, dude.
The Day of the Rope is a reference to the white nationalist book titled The Turner Diaries. The novel depicts a story of an alt-history America, where a group of white nationalists rise up, take control of the government, and start a race war, as it's called. They would gather people who they deemed as race traitors and kill them. The day of these murders would be referred to in the novel as the Day of the Rope. In Your Caesar's Rome, the Day of the Rope was an event they had organized every so often. A video taken from one of these events would showcase just how dark this group actually was. A group of soldiers would move throughout the map, chanting death to the race traitors as they marched. They would
I don't understand this because, like, why would you join this? Like, if you're a black person or you have even a black avatar, why would you join this? And then if you did join it on accident and you were treated like this, wouldn't you just leave and never come back? And then now what? Now they've successfully ethnically cleansed their Roblox server. And then what? I don't get it. Mike's Pax, thank you for the 200 bits. Appreciate that.
question civilians as they passed, and they would kill anyone who was suspected of being a race traitor.
Oh, you assume they make alts with dark skin, so they're like role playing the like marginalized people too?
Although Math-Minded had visualized these events in his Temple of Apollo, he wasn't exactly complicit. In fact, he had been accused of something that was completely unacceptable in Rome. He was, allegedly, homosexual. But when your Caesar found out about this, he did something unexpected. Instead of immediately removing Math-Minded, he decided to reason with him. He had told Math-Minded that in order for him to stay in Rome, he had to become, quote, red-pilled, and he had to take the anti-gay pills as well.
Oh my god.
Whatever this
Okay, listen, dude, you're gonna need to be red pilled, and once you take the anti-gay pill, watch this gay porn and send me a picture of your dick. And it better not be hard, all right, dude? But if it's hard, send it to me anyway. Accountability, brother. I'm looking out for you. I'm looking out for you, man. You gotta send me the pic so that I know that you took the anti-gay pills, okay?
this meant. Of course, Math-Minded wasn't exactly all too happy. The culture and the persecution against him had disgusted him, and so he would pack his bags and remove himself from this dark community. But it wouldn't be that easy for Math-Minded to escape. In fact, your Caesar felt as if he still needed him in order to push this group forward. He was in need of the development that Math-Minded had provided, so he would do something. He would take things too far. Math-Minded sat in his home.
Now it's too far? It's being taken too far now? You didn't think that the virtual lynching parties were too far? It's been too far. Okay? Everything has been too far.
Knowing he can no longer be persecuted or harassed from this group of people any longer. At least, that's what he thought. Suddenly, the phone was ringing. Who could be calling this late? He didn't answer, but the caller had left a voicemail, so he walked over to the phone and opened the voicemail. What he heard was disturbing, to say the least.
Your call has been forwarded to an automatic voice message system. At the tone, please record your message.
You think you can run away, but you can't. See, what's gonna happen here is I'm gonna start dealing with consequences. You know those are coming. You know shit will hit the fan. And I really actually don't need you. But alright, if you want to continue this game, you want to continue it, just don't want to participate.
That's not a kid. I doubt this is the real... Oh, it says voice pitch distorted to protect his privacy? Fuck his privacy. Who is this creator?
I don't want to
Is this the real voicemail? I feel like it's just a fake.
experience the goodness that is reward. Be my guest. Continue. Stay gone.
It was your Caesar, who had somehow gotten access to his home phone number. He had demanded Math-Minded stop his, quote, degenerate actions and return to Rome to help with development.
This is your friend. I'm just calling to check in and, call you a complete fucking, waste of time and energy. Because that's really what you are right now. And
It's awesome because this guy who's talking has absolutely no skills. He's just like a master manipulator. And the person he's talking to developed the fucking server.
so I really been done, and, I know you're really busy, playing around with your, these degenerates, with whoever you play games with, behind our backs, so.
Behind our backs.
I just want you to kind of fight your inner nature here and, come back and, I don't know, work on something with me, because, I need to work on this with someone who has higher IQ than, so, just check it in. Bye-bye.
But your Caesar didn't just stop after these voicemails. In fact, when Math-Minded logged into his Skype account, another surprise had been waiting for him.
I mean, listen, people that are obsessed with IQ, I think they're obsessed with it because they know that theirs is low. And this would be evidence of that. I think people who are, listen, it's not I'm not saying it's 100% of the time, But if you have a weird obsession with IQ, probably because you took a test and you weren't very excited about the results, and you were not invited when all the other gifted kids went to their special class at school, and you never really got over it, you know?
It's been a long time since you abandoned me.
Wait, you have video of this guy? Okay, wait, hold on. Just fucking, what are we doing? What are we doing? You have video of this guy who's an adult going into children's spaces and Nazifying it? And we're protecting his identity? The fuck is this?
Let me tell you something. Don't do that. Don't do that. I'm gonna send you videos and voice recordings of myself cursing you in the name and your family and everything. You won't get a nice video message like this coming straight from my office.
From my office. My mom's bedroom.
It's my office, by the way. This is the office of the Lego Reichs Ministry. I've got my flag, as you can see. Alright, thank you.
One of the core and more memorable aspects of the group was, of course, its military. The organization and expectations of the legions were pretty thorough for its time. Legions were expected to muster...
This feels Canadian.
For every time they were called upon, and the only people who had authority to levy the legions were the Senate, or the Emperor himself. Legionary soldiers would frequent the Roman Parthia game, patrolling, training, and participating in events. Players felt a part of something bigger than themselves. The Roblox Roman Empire as a whole would rally hundreds of men, a crazy feat at this time. But what was an army in Roblox? I mean, I guess it was cool to walk around in Roman armor, but they did really have a greater purpose. In fact, Your Caesar's Rome wasn't the only ancient-themed faction at this time. There were plenty of others. For the sake of the video, I put them all out on a map, at least the more prominent ones during this time. The Greek city-state of Sparta was a pretty sizable faction and was led by multiple leaders, but most notably Themistocles. North of Sparta, there were a bunch of other Greek factions, but for the sake of the video, I'm just going to group them all together and label them as the Greek states. If we move north, you'll see a big blob here. This faction was known as the Suebi. They were like a German tribal faction, constantly raiding the Romans. There were a few other factions a bit farther away, but we'll get to them later in the video.
Yeah, Chateau, this is totally something that Cartman would do, bro. This kid is actually Cartman.
This group of Roblox factions became known as the ancient genre. It was essentially the term for any Roblox military group that identified itself as taking place within this historical period. The Suebi faction hated Rome. Their games were littered with crucified Roman soldiers and other disturbing effigies. And as a result, of course, Rome would declare war on this faction. This is possibly one of the first wars in the genre, at least the oldest documented war. Wars in Roblox might seem confusing to some, but I'll explain it very quickly how they work. Usually, two Roblox groups decide they don't like each other and they want to fight one another. So they declare war on each other, and most of the time they will agree beforehand how many battles must be won for one side to win the war. And usually these battles are balanced between the two factions' own maps. So for example, with this Suebi war, although not documented too well, it was probably set up where the Romans had to win a certain amount of battles on their own and on the enemy's games. And whoever wins the majority wins the war. It's pretty simple, right? Anyways, so back to this war that I was just talking about. Your Caesar would only send around 1 to 2...
I'm so lost, I just came into the stream. Is this all on the same server or something? I don't know. I think there are like different ancient servers. Wait, okay, Prodigy is Roman posting in the chat. We'll look into that in a second. But as far as I understand, there are different, there's like a Roman server, there's a Suebi server, there's like a Sparta server, and they all hate each other or something? Okay, now Prodigy's Roman posting. Let's see what this is. This channel is skipping some interesting details. The Praetorian Guard, Malcolm's personal army, according to several former members, he sometimes asks high-ranking members to read SS manuals and listen to a far-right podcast about a school shooter. Simple, friendly banter among friends, Malcolm says. Chip started an Einsatzgruppen division, a reference to the Nazis' mobile death squads, partly because he thought it would get laughs, partly to please the Caesar. The fuck? And there's a Wired article about these guys. How Roblox became a playground for virtual fascists. Oh my god.
2 legions to confront the Suebi faction. That's all he really needed. Keep in mind, Rome's army was massive. The Suebis could not even compete in terms of manpower. The 15th Roman legion would attack the Suebi, almost by surprise, and they would capture the fort with ease. The Suebi were just no match for the Romans, to be fair, and this war would last only around 2 months. The Romans, of course, would...
Gmod to this day allows Nazi RP. I thought they took it off. I thought they had a moment where Gary, the guy from the main guy, was like, no, you can't, like, no more of that.
Win the war, and for now...
But yeah, I went like a month or it was probably like 2 months ago. I went through like a massive YouTube rabbit hole of Gmod Nazi RP. And I was trying to think how I could like do it on stream, or if there's a way I could like explore it on stream, but I think it's just like too much. Too many slurs, too much like racism and shit. I could never figure out how to do it like well.
The German tribe would be dealt with. But there was a much larger threat. A threat that could really challenge Rome's superiority over this genre of factions. Greece. More specifically, Sparta. They had a decently sized army. Of course, nothing compared to that of Rome, but they were a pretty dedicated set of people. They trained a lot, and they were on the game for a long time. Some factions were even active before Rome was a thing. To tame Greece would be very difficult. It consisted of many different factions, all blobbed together in this region. But your Caesar wanted to control this region in order to further cement his hegemony. Rome would send legions to divide and conquer the factions of Greece, without declaring any official war. The purpose of this was to bend the knee of Greece and force them to view Rome as superior.
Do these people just like... I don't understand. Your parents just let you hang out all day long? Like they just let you hang out like this your whole life? You don't have to like get a job?
The first few legions arrived in Macedon, where they would engage with the Greeks. Winning these first few engagements, the Classis Italia would invade Cyprus with the help of a few legions. And at first, the Romans were winning these battles.
Yeah, I know about Red Dead RP.
The Greece they went, the tougher the battles became. So Rome was going to need their most elite units if they wanted to fight Sparta. These guys were no easy target. Sparta was a Roblox faction that was active for a very long time.
Okay.
And as a result, their members were